Surveying the wreckage as New Yorkers struggle to pick up the pieces, President Bush vows to whip terrorism.
This is a terrible moment. But this country will not relent until we have saved ourselves and others from the terrible tragedy that came upon America.
And photographs are all that remain for many families who still hope that somehow their loved ones survived. I'm Colleen McEdwards.
And I'm Jim Clancy. This is CNN's continuing coverage of America Under Attack.
We want to begin right now with a new development in this ongoing investigation of the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. Philippine President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo says the Philippines and the United States have conducted a joint raid. Here we are in connection with the investigation. Mrs. Arroyo says the raid took place at the Bayview Hotel in Manila on Wednesday. That was one day after the attacks in the United States. The hotel is located near the U.S. Embassy. No word yet on whether anyone was detained. Well, heightened security at New York City's major airports has resulted in at least 8 arrests. CNN's Mike Betcher is following that story and has more.
One of those people arrested was at Kennedy Airport. He was carrying a fake pilot's ID. He was arrested and taken away for questioning. Also at Kennedy Airport, there were another 4 or 5 people who had either false documentation or were in the country illegally who were also arrested and taken away for questioning.
At New York's LaGuardia Airport, police detained at least 2 other men for questioning. After the spate of arrests and detentions, all New York area airports were closed again. A few other airports in the U.S. have also shut down once more because of security concerns. Attorney General John Ashcroft said FBI agents are making progress in their investigation, adding that they have identified the hijackers aboard all 4 ill-fated jets.
The total number of hijackers, to our best estimate and our best knowledge, given the information at this time, on the 4 planes that crashed was at least 18.
4,000 FBI agents have fanned out across the country, knocking on hundreds of doors. But before this is closed and over, they're going to have to knock on tens of thousands more doors.
All right, Mike Betcher, thanks. In New York, they're bleary-eyed from grief, but still clutching to hope. Hundreds of friends and family members of those missing from the collapse of the World Trade Center have been lining the streets of Manhattan. They're giving authorities any information that they can, from dental records to photos, anything that might help locate or identify their loved ones. But as the minutes become hours, the hours become days. Many people say their hopes are turning to fears for the worst. Rescuers have been battling into the night in a tireless effort to try to locate anyone who might still be alive. But despite their best efforts, no survivors were found in the rubble on Thursday. New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani says that more than 4,700 people are still missing. Jim.
The mayor of New York also urging the people of his city to be patient as the painstaking rescue and recovery effort really pushes ahead. CNN's Garrick Utley has been monitoring the situation in New York. He joins us now once again live. Hello, Garrick.
Yes, Jim, and as we've been saying really for the past couple of days, one of the interesting aspects of the human dynamics here, the communication between officialdom and people who are still waiting for news about their friends and family who may have been lost at the Trade Center, is how the officials, starting right with Mayor Giuliani, are not offering or holding out undue hope. They are not really going any further beyond precisely what they know. They put the figure out, 4,600, 4,700 people believed to be missing, and the subtext of that is that the fear is that they probably have been lost, with perhaps 1 or 2 miraculous exceptions who will be found. So there is sort of a waiting process going on here. Now, you can call that grieving. You can call that just holding out hope day after day. Whatever you want to call it, it has a very human face. And our Jody Ross, who's over at the Armory where people have been gathering, has some examples of those hopes and how they continue to burn bright. Jody?
Yeah, Garrick, I think I would call it hope out here. This is becoming an all too familiar sight here in New York City and probably now all over the world. Pictures, posters, signs about missing people, men and women who haven't been seen since the terrorist attack on Tuesday. This picture belongs to this family here with me. You guys tell me about Moira.
This is my Aunt Moira Smith. She's a NYPD police officer currently the only female police officer that's missing in this terrible tragedy. She was the first one of the first ones to see the first plane hit the building. She called it in right away, and she was last seen in the second tower on the first or second floor at 9:30 on Tuesday, and she was helping people. And that's all she really wants to do, is help people. And if you have any information, if you've seen her, or you can give us any information whatsoever, we're desperate here. Just call the 13th precinct. That's who she's with. And
Mercedes, tell me, has there been any information, any leads, any news about her?
As Allison said, the last news we got is that a detective saw her in Tower 2 on the second or first floor around 9:30 yesterday, and he said she was just doing a remarkable job, pulling people out, helping people, comforting people, and she's dedicated to the people of New York and to her fellow officers, and she's just, she's just a remarkable person, and we know everyone is doing everything they can, but just if anyone has seen her, we're trying to find. We're not going to leave any rock unturned. We're going to find her. We're hopeful. We're prayerful. We're praying for Moira, and we're praying for all the rescue workers, and, I don't know, she's just a remarkable person, and we know she's coming home. We're just trying to make it happen quicker, and...
Is that your feeling? You feel like she's out there and just needs to be found?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Allison, you mentioned that you're having trouble sleeping, and it's hard to have a normal life right now.
Well, absolutely. I think everyone, no one is unaffected by this. I mean, everyone I know knows someone who's been affected by this, and we're all praying, and I just hope everyone out there is praying for everyone in the world right now.
I think that is the case. Did you want to say something?
I brought this picture. This picture was taken in July 6th at my brother's wedding, and this is Moira and her husband Jim, who's also a police officer, and her baby Patricia Mary, who's 2 years old. So I know, as I just said, everybody's doing everything they can, but if people need encouragement to keep looking, think of Patricia Mary. This is her face right here, and help us bring her mother home. She's 2 years old.
And the first New York female police officer so far missing in action.
That's the report we got. That's the information we were told. So, and the New York police have been unbelievably supportive of our family. We can't thank them enough.
Good luck to you. Okay, thank you very much. Well, that's the feeling here. We meet so many people like this, so many stories. They get to sort of tell their stories behind me at the Armory, which is open 24 hours. It's raining now. I don't think that's going to deter anybody from coming down here and doing what they can to help, because it's impossible, New Yorkers tell me, to sit at home and do nothing. They have to do something, whether they're here providing food, providing support, providing comfort, or they're here to actually find people that are missing. Whatever the case, New Yorkers are out in full force tonight, in spite of the weather. Garrett, back to you.
Thank you very much, Jody. We're hearing those very personal stories, and of course, there are stories which are tragedy, and there are too many of them in New York and in the Pentagon in that area because of the tragedy there and the plane that was lost over Pennsylvania. But stories also have contrast. There are two sides of what are going on, or two parts, and we're seeing that this day, both on Thursday and today, Friday, and for days to come in Manhattan and New York City, because the city is coming back to life. There are the people gathering at the Armory and trying to find out what's happened to their friends and family. But at the very same time, schools were open, most businesses were open, and tonight on Broadway, the lights went back on, as they say. The Broadway theaters started up again. The show is going on. The lights are bright in Times Square. Times Square is filled with more and more people after these past 3 nights of almost total emptiness and an eerie silence. So these are the dual channels of human life, of narrative, if you will, which we're hearing these days. And we want to hear another example of that from one of our reporters, Maria Hinojosa, who visited some people who are also still holding out hope.
Just 7 weeks ago, Anne McGovern posed with her new grandson minutes after he was born.
I've never seen her look so happy as when he was born. She was there. She was so excited.
But now her daughter Terry wants that smiling picture on television. Her mother worked on one of the top floors of the World Trade Center. Her daughter wonders if anyone has seen her alive.
We were interviewed by police detectives, and we had filled out a questionnaire, and it was really like, what jewelry would she have been wearing? Do you know what she had on? Did she have any identifying body marks?
Her sister Liz worked in the World Financial Center across the street, but managed to escape. She was supposed to meet her mother that day for lunch.
I was just about to call her, and I can't believe it. I don't think it's set in yet. I just feel so powerless, and I wish I could have done something.
That same awful feeling consumed an emergency center on Lexington Avenue, where authorities are compiling a list of the missing. It's become a place of public grieving and a place to hope for miracles.
He was on 104th floor, Ken Fitzgerald. We've gone to hospitals. We've called every hotline. They don't know where we can't find him. He's not on any list. So.
Hope is the word, the emotion that keeps these people going. But that hope hits hard against the reality that thousands of body bags have already arrived into New York City.
Triage centers remain relatively quiet. The one at Stuyvesant
At a center for Mexican immigrants, 15 friends are confirmed dead so far. Radios are kept on in hopes there'll be word of hundreds of others, immigrants from Mexico who labored in the Twin Towers, hoping to make a better life.
In my heart, I feel that I'm crying.
But there is not much concrete news for these people today, just fears for the worst.
My mother was so excited that my son was born. She was there at the birth 7 weeks ago, and he's not going to know her.
And so there's resignation. Maria Hinojosa, CNN, New York.
Just one more example, or several examples of the scars left by what happened here last Tuesday. Jim?
Well, let's face it, there are people down there around where the World Trade Center used to be this night, risking their lives, trying to recover people alive, trying to recover bodies, trying to perhaps bring some hope to all of those thousands of people that we've seen here in the last few minutes waiting to find something about their loved ones. But now there's also a rainstorm moving in. What kind of a threat is that going to pose to the rescue workers with all of that dust in the area?
Well, one of the good strokes of fortune these past several days has been the beautiful, excellent weather amid this tragedy. But you're right, the storm is moving in. Even inside here, we can hear the thunder outside. And you're going to get some pictures, I think, showing some of the lightning which has been striking around Manhattan. Obviously, if it's a severe thunderstorm, a downpour, that may stop things or slow work down for a little bit. But if it's and that thunderstorm may well move on. But if there is a steady rain, which sometimes sort of descends and stays over Manhattan, well, what the heck? People have slickers, ponchos, the work goes on. As one person was saying, if we really get into rain, we have to remember one thing. We're supposed to be in a war against terrorism right now, the president says, and war is never called timeout on account of rain. And I think that's the attitude you'll find in lower Manhattan as this bad weather moves in and continues.
All right, Garrick Utley there, reporting once again. We're going to come back and visit with Garrick again. Colleen?
All right, the weather obviously a concern, but a steady stream of evacuations, bomb threats, and arrests is also keeping the nation on edge. Vice President Dick Cheney has been separated from the president as a precaution, and the White House apparently has some renewed security concerns. President Bush, meanwhile, is preparing for his first trip to New York since the attacks. With more on all of this, we go to Major Garrett. Major, what are those security concerns?
Well, Colleen, before I summarize the security concerns, let's cover some breaking news. CNN has confirmed that the White House and Congress have reached a deal for $40 billion of emergency aid for New York and for Virginia and for the prosecution of what Mr. Bush has called the first war of the 21st century, a war against global terrorism. That deal was reached moments ago between White House negotiators, senior members of the Democratic and Republican leadership from the House and the Senate. Sources tell CNN that $40 billion emergency supplemental spending bill will be on the floor of the House of Representatives sometime later on today, Friday afternoon, maybe into the Friday evening. The Senate is expected to then pass it soon thereafter. This legislation should be prepared for the president's signature no later than Saturday. Also on Saturday, there should be considerable debate on Capitol Hill and passage of a use of force resolution authorizing the president to prosecute that war against global terrorism. But to repeat, CNN has confirmed a deal between White House and senior congressional negotiators over a supplemental emergency spending bill of $40 billion, $20 billion of that set aside for immediate cleanup, rescue, recovery efforts in Virginia at the Pentagon and in downtown New York at the site of the World Trade Center catastrophe, and then $20 billion for beefed up counterterrorism activities, and also potentially to carry out any activities or any raids, military or otherwise, against those thought responsible for the terrorist attacks here in the United States. As for the President's Day on Thursday, it was very busy indeed on several fronts, not only working with Congress on this supplemental bill and a use of force resolution, but also dealing with the symbolism of healing. The President and the First Lady, Laura Bush, went to the George Washington Hospital Center to visit and commiserate with those recovering from their injuries of the plane crashing into the Pentagon on Tuesday, also talking to some of the rescue workers, responding as the President and the First Lady often must do in situations like this, setting a note of sympathy and extended their heartfelt congratulations to some of those who helped rescue those and sympathy to those who are recovering from their injuries. Also, the President, by phone, spoke to those who have been on the front line in New York. Governor George Pataki, the Republican governor of New York, and the Republican mayor of New York City, Rudolph Giuliani. From the Oval Office, President Bush talked to both of them, thanking them for all of their efforts in New York to rally firefighters, police officers, volunteers, rescue efforts, and all the work, the massive work that's going on in New York City to deal with the tragedy, the catastrophe there.
People of New York City and
after concluding his telephone conversation with those two leaders in New York, the President took a few questions, and as the reporters asked him about the gravity of this situation, he said the country must be prepared to fight the first war of the 21st century.
Through the tears of sadness, I see an opportunity. You know, make no mistake about it, this nation is sad. But we're also tough and resolute. And now's an opportunity to do generations a favor by coming together and whipping terrorism, hunting it down, finding it, and holding them accountable. The nation must understand this is now the focus of my administration.
Senior administration officials tell CNN it was a very important note the President wanted to strike in that response, feeling that there was a pervasive sense in the country that this nation will never, ever be the same. And what the President wanted to do in those remarks is say, well, that very well may be true, but it doesn't mean we will not be the same and all the changes will be negative. Perhaps, just perhaps, this country can, in fact, wage a war that the world will join it in waging that will change the world for the better, stressing the opportunity, perhaps, to do generations of Americans yet unborn a good service by dealing with terrorism, combating it, and hopefully rooting it out. That was definitely a note the President wanted to strike. He had many other notes struck by the administration today, one by the First Lady Laura Bush, speaking for many Americans and trying to, in some ways, describe the scope of the tragedy.
I was not frightened for myself. I was, like every American, concerned about everyone who was in the World Trade Center, and also so unbelievably saddened that something like this would happen in our country, and that the disregard for life of the people who did this was so profound that they would harm people who were going about their daily lives. And, it's a terrible, terrible tragedy.
Of course, White House staff is trying to also go about its daily lives, but that's much more difficult now than it was on Monday. The security perimeter around the White House was extended this afternoon by the Secret Service, extended by several blocks. And throughout the afternoon and this evening, there have been innumerable false alarms, even as I speak to you now, Colleen. In the early morning darkness here in Washington, D.C., a search helicopter hovers over the White House, its searchlight piercing the early morning darkness. It is a sight and a sound I've never felt or seen before here in the nation's capital. Colleen?
Major Garrett, thanks very much. Jim?
Well, let's go across the Potomac River to the Pentagon, where just a little while ago, flames briefly flared again from the wreckage there. Mark Potter joins us now live. Mark?
Hi, Jim. You're right to characterize it as briefly. There was a little bit of fire for a while, but it was quickly put out. Now, the big news here at the Pentagon tonight is that sources say a decision has not been made yet, but that President Bush is considering activating as many as 50,000 military reservists to help with the disaster recovery efforts and to relieve National Guard pilots who have been standing by or flying combat air patrols around the country. Meanwhile, here at the building tonight, as you can see here, workers continue to work in the rubble under very bright spotlights, looking for bodies and for the so-called black boxes from the American Airlines 757 that crashed here Tuesday. Now, earlier today, the county fire chief said officials thought they heard pinging sound from one of the boxes, either the voice recorder or the data recorder, but says that officials looked around in the area and so far have been unable to find anything. At a news briefing, the Deputy Secretary of Defense said that whenever the U.S. decides to respond to the recent terrorist attacks, it will be long-term and widespread.
I think one thing is clear is that you don't do it with just a single military strike, no matter how dramatic. You don't do it with just military forces alone. You do it with the full resources of the U.S. government. It will be a campaign, not a single action. And we're going to keep after these people and the people who support them until this stops.
Now, meanwhile, back here at the Pentagon, officials now estimate that around 190 people died in the attack here on the building. That includes the 64 who were aboard the plane. One of the survivors of the attack, a Navy lieutenant, talked with us today and said right after the plane crashed into the building, everyone rallied to help the injured.
It was actually very calm. Everybody was looking out for everybody else, different services, Army, Navy, Air Force. Everybody was working together to, make sure you need help. And a lot of the civilians were, it seemed like a lot more of the civilians were injured than the military, and everybody was rushing to everybody's aid to help out.
Now, as of late this afternoon, officials said about 70 bodies had been recovered from the building. They are being taken to the Dover Air Force Base mortuary in Delaware. And for those people who have been looking up into the skies, seeing combat aircraft flying overhead, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, said that combat air patrols are still being flown in the Washington, D.C., New York City corridor, and that fighter pilots are on a 15-minute standby at 26 military bases around the country. And as we leave you, here's another view of the building tonight. Things seem quiet here, but workers are working in the rubble 24 hours a day, sifting through the debris, looking for bodies, looking for the black boxes, shoring up the building so that they can get farther into the rubble to look for the rest of the victims. They do not expect to find any more survivors here. Jim and Colleen, back to you.
All right. Mark Parda, thank you for that report. Well, as the victims' families try to come to terms with devastating pain, many are telling chilling tales of their loved ones' final moments. We spoke to Deborah Burlingame. Her brother was the pilot of the hijacked aircraft that slammed into the Pentagon.
I used to be a flight attendant many, many years ago, so in addition to my brother, we really feel a connection with airline people and have a lot of airline friends, apart from my brother. And so we're devastated to see these scenes like this, and this is just an extraordinary scene. So I didn't know what he was saying. He was screaming, and then I caught the word chick. It's chick. And there's no words to describe. You know, you hear crime victims' families being told, this is a murder scene. This is a mass murder.
Captain Charles Burlingame was one of the 64 passengers and crew on board that Los Angeles-bound flight.
Well, President Bush and his senior aides have left the world in no doubt that they consider Tuesday's terrorist attacks on New York and Washington acts of war. U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell says careful consideration is being given to an appropriate response.
So you have to consider you're dealing with a very, very skilled, knowledgeable, thinking enemy. And we just have to think better than them, think faster than them, and be cleverer than them in order to respond in a sensible way with all of the weapons at our disposal. And one of those weapons is military force used in an appropriate way. It's not so much the size of whatever military response you might have, but does it do the job? Does it get to the heart of the problem?
All right, and you heard earlier that President Bush calling these terrorist strikes the first war of the 21st century. So as Washington studies a range of military options to take against those responsible for the attack. U.S. troop strength already is on the rise at an overseas airbase that could play a strategic role. Jane Araf reports now from the predominantly Muslim country, Turkey.
This is one of the biggest U.S. air bases in the region. On Turkish territory leased by the U.S., it is, Turkish military sources here say, gearing up for a possible military strike. They say in the past 2 days, the U.S. has sent in more personnel, adding to the 7,000 troops it already has in southeastern Turkey. Movements in the town surrounding the base have been restricted. U.S. military officials won't comment on the new measures. Since the end of the Gulf War, U.S. planes have taken off from Incirlik to patrol and sometimes bomb northern Iraq, though the economy of southeastern Turkey relies on trade from Iraq. Also neighbor to Iran and Syria, Muslim Turkey is making clear its loyalties lie with the U.S.
I don't specify any country in our struggle against terrorism, and we will certainly support fully the Article 5 of NATO.
That article, invoked by NATO for the first time, treats the attack on the United States as an attack on all NATO members. Turkey's prime minister says that means Turkey would allow Incirlik to be used to strike whoever was behind the U.S. attack. There was military and emotional support here, as throughout Ankara Thursday, the Turkish Star and Crescent, the symbol of Islam, flew at half-staff alongside the Stars and Stripes in mourning for the dead. But in this country, a NATO member and a Muslim ally of the United States, the shockwaves are still being felt. Turkey's economy also staggered under the tragedy. Already in crisis, the Turkish lira fell further.
We have realized that we will be faced with additional economic problems while trying to deal with the economic crisis. We know that it's a global problem also.
Tourism was hit as cruise ships stopping in Istanbul kept their passengers on board. Like Americans around the globe, those here were told by their embassy to keep a low profile. Jane Araf, CNN, Ankara.
Well, searchers have found the flight data recorder from the plane that crashed in western Pennsylvania on Tuesday morning. The data recorder from United Airlines Flight 93 was found in the crater caused by the plane when it crashed there. The passenger jet was en route to San Francisco from Newark when it was taken over by hijackers and rerouted. The passengers apparently tried to wrest control from the hijackers, causing the plane to crash before it reached whatever target the hijackers were aiming for. The flight's cockpit voice recorder, though, has not been found. Still searches going on for that.
All right, well, last December, a pilot instructor in Florida gave flying lessons to 2 men who claimed to be student pilots from the Middle East.
That's right. They're now suspects in Tuesday's attacks, and they may have flown 2 of the hijacked planes. John Zarella investigates how they managed to pull this off.
Unfortunately, sadly enough,
Henry George feels pain, extreme frustration, and great regret.
I don't want to believe that what I did made him successful.
Last December 29th and 30th at his Opa-locka Flight Training School, George gave 2 Middle Eastern men some basic lessons in a simulator on how to fly a jet aircraft. The 2 men were Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shari. The FBI is now combing through apartments in South Florida, checking cars and mailboxes, all linked to Mohammed Atta. Law enforcement sources say Atta is a suspect in the attack, perhaps a pilot of one of the doomed jets. He was listed on the manifest of American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston. Marwan al-Shari, according to German authorities, was also aboard one of the hijacked planes. The story Atta and al-Shari gave their flight instructor was this.
They were on their way home, and they wanted the exposure to jet flying, or an introduction to jet flying, because they were hoping to get a job with their airline in their country.
George says they mentioned Egypt a couple of times, but generally during the 2 days, they didn't have much to say. No small talk.
They were low-key individuals, maybe even call them shy. There wasn't a You know, they were not outspoken, opinionated type people.
In all, George says he spent 8 hours with the two men. They reserved their lessons with a credit card but paid in cash, $1,500. George says he wishes something about them had been suspicious.
He was using his own name. They provide you with credit card numbers. You know, there was nothing that you would make you suspect that this individual was anything but above board.
George says they were just a couple of student pilots, and there was nothing special about their abilities.
What I can recollect from my memory is that we mostly did turns in a couple of approaches. I don't think we did any more than that.
What they didn't do, George says, was practice how to land. John Zarella, CNN, Miami.
Well, if there is U.S. military retaliation, one of the likely targets could be prime suspect Osama bin Laden. But experts say any operation against bin Laden, if there is one, could prove difficult.
Bin Laden, when I met with him, was surrounded by a group of at least a couple of dozen heavily armed men who are armed with RPGs and Russian submachine guns. They're highly motivated. They're prepared to die. And that was just in the course of just doing an interview. Obviously, bin Laden must be very concerned about his security right now, and he has hundreds of followers who might be surrounding him. Also, any American military operation in Afghanistan would be conducted in some of the most inhospitable terrain in the world. It's a rocky, mountainous, desert region. It's an area with which bin Laden is very familiar and with which Americans aren't very familiar. The last time America had a presence in Afghanistan was in 1989. Since then, the embassy there has been closed. So the information the United States has about the country is second-hand and old.
And bin Laden is known to have all manner of hiding places. The Associated Press quotes Pakistani intelligence sources as saying that bin Laden moved to a new hiding place just minutes after the attacks in the United States. Jim?
As investigations press on, Saudi-born dissident Osama bin Laden is, of course, as we've said, top at the list of suspects. Chief International Correspondent Chris Yamanpour takes a closer look at bin Laden and the country where he's believed to have taken refuge.
When the Soviet Union invaded the treacherous and mountainous terrain of Afghanistan on the eve of the 1980s, it quickly found its own Vietnam. This superpower was taken on and eventually forced out by a network of Afghan guerrilla groups known as the Mujahideen. The Cold War was still on, and the United States helped recruit these resistance fighters through its allies in the region, allies like Pakistan, which borders Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was one of those fighters, and after the war with the Soviets, he took control of the guerrilla network, which was swelled by fighters from all over the Islamic world.
Bin Laden's group grew out of the Mujahideen forces that were trained initially by the Pakistani intelligence services and the Pakistani military, and also, of course, funded by the United States.
But the United States is faulted for failing to track the growing ranks of radical Muslim guerrillas once the Soviet occupation ended. Afghanistan then descended into civil war and eventually split into two main blocs. On one side, the Northern Alliance, a loose network of ethnic minorities, nominally led by the charismatic Ahmad Shah Massoud, known as the Afghan mastermind of the Soviet defeat. He has not been seen since a bomb attack by assassins last week. On the other side, the Taliban, a fundamentalist Islamic movement representing the ethnic majority. They captured the capital, Kabul, in 1996 and are now in control of almost all Afghanistan. But their repressive regime, particularly their harsh treatment of women, have earned them almost universal condemnation. The West also accuses the Taliban of harboring Osama bin Laden, America's enemy number one. Pakistan is one of only 3 countries recognizing the Taliban as the legitimate government, and now it's under intense pressure from the United States to get the Taliban to give up bin Laden.
We regard terrorism as an evil that threatens the world community. Concerted international effort is needed to fight terrorism in all its forms and manifestations.
Experts point out the Taliban itself is divided between hardliners and some who would prefer more cooperation with the West. Some analysts believe the United States should now offer ultimatums and incentives to the Taliban to give up bin Laden, at least as a first measure before a military attack. Christiana Manpour, CNN, London.
Well, as Christiane just mentioned, Pakistan has been put in what you might call a unique position by this week's events. Islamabad has pledged to support the United States, but Washington wants proof. Tom Montier has been monitoring the situation for us in Pakistan. He joins us now live with more. Tom, to what extent can cooperation from Pakistan be counted on?
Well, Colleen, that's a $64 million question right now. The U.S. State Department has heard the words. Now they want to see the deeds. They have heard the Pakistani president promise complete support, but they're also looking down below that first level of government into the military, into the security and intelligence apparatus. How much support, how much information are they going to get from them? The ISI, the Inter-Service Intelligence Operation here, indeed has a lot of information about bin Laden. As you heard earlier, the movement of bin Laden just after the attack on the United States to a new location. That came out of Pakistani intelligence sources. So the promises have been made. There have been requests by the U.S. government to the Pakistanis to hold up the supply of fuel into Afghanistan, to have bin Laden supporters suppressed in their movements in Pakistan. Basically, the United States is asking a lot, and we'll have to wait and see how much of what they're asking for is delivered. Now, if and when there is any type of military action, airstrikes, the Pakistani airspace would be important. It was closed this morning as the Pakistani military was using the skies. They grounded all civilian flights for several hours. People were stranded at airports all across Pakistan. I just saw about 10 minutes ago a large jetliner of leaving here in Islamabad, so the airspace is indeed open once again. And there are meetings going on within the government and within the military about what to do next, what steps to take to offer this cooperation that the Pakistani president has promised. Colleen?
All right. CNN's Tom Montier, thanks very much. Jim?
All right, we want to bring you up to date now on some of the latest developments, beginning with the continued rescue operations in New York City. Workers there digging through the mammoth pile of rubble created by the collapse of the World Trade Center. They're hoping to find survivors, but with each passing hour, those hopes are fading. No new survivors were found on Thursday. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani says around 4,700 people are still missing. People all across the country are mourning and remembering the victims with candlelight vigils and special services. Friday has been designated as a national day of prayer and remembrance. Tensions remain high in New York City. Police received more than 90 false bomb threats by noon on Thursday. Also, authorities have arrested at least 8 people at the city's 2 major airports. Authorities say that 4 of those arrested were seen at one of the airports the day of the attacks. Law enforcement sources tell CNN the 4 fled as they were challenged at the ticket counter. For more now on the situation in New York, let's turn once again to CNN's Garrick Utley. Garrick.
Yes, Jim, and perhaps a footnote about this tragedy. The fact that New York one day would be the target of a terrorist attack was not really a surprise, although it was a surprise that it happened when it did on Tuesday morning. And what I mean by that is that for years, the city government here, led by New York City's various mayors, has known that terrorists would have it in for the United States, would look at New York, its landmarks, some of which now lie in rubble, as a promising and tantalizing target. So what they did is that they went ahead and built an emergency command operation or control center, a bunker, if you will, just in case the worst would happen. Well, the worst has happened now, and where did the city planners put that emergency control center? In the World Trade Center. How's that for planning? Fortunately, the senior officials, including Mayor Giuliani, were not there when those towers came down. And now, because they're down, the search continues, and Gary Tuchman is down in the area in Lower Manhattan, giving us the latest after quite a rainstorm swept through town. Gary?
Well, that's right, Garrick. It's now thundering lightning, and just a short time ago, it started pouring, and that will not help the search effort one bit. Behind me, the ruins are still smoldering. It casts an eerie light in the rainy sky. That smoke has now been going for 2.5 days. There are workers out there 24 hours a day. The only time the emergency workers haven't been out there is when there have been evacuation orders, concerns over 3 buildings in the area, concerns they're structurally unsound and they could collapse on the workers. So they have had to evacuate them a few times, but otherwise they've been out there 24 hours a day. However, some of them have left now because about 5 minutes ago it was pouring very heavily like a monsoon. It's let up a little bit, so hopefully they will come back in a short time and continue their work looking for survivors. It's very hard for us to believe that those 110-story structures are gone. When you used to come down the street, whether you were driving or jogging, there's a beautiful path along the Hudson River here. You saw the 2 110-story towers. They were landmarks. They are now completely gone. It's hard to believe. But what's even harder to believe is the fact that there may be as many as 4,700 bodies in the rubble just a few blocks away from us. Now, some emergency officials are telling us that despite the fact that no survivors were found today, they are still hopeful that there are pockets there, pockets in which they will find people who are still alive, but it hasn't happened. There was an exciting moment today. Police officials and hospital officials told us that 5 firefighters were pulled out of the rubble alive after being there since these buildings collapsed. But it was because of confusion that it was reported like that. These fire officials were rescued, and rescue workers saw them and said this to the police and to the hospital officials. However, it turned out that these firemen got trapped today while they were participating in the rescue also. So they were rescued, and that's good news, but they weren't in there since Tuesday. Now, we've met up with many rescue workers throughout this endeavor over the last 2.5 days, and we've seen rescue workers for years covering disasters all over the country and all over the world. But what's different about this particular time is the fact that none of the people we've spoken with have ever seen anything like this before, the magnitude of this, and they tell us they hope never to see anything like this again. Garrick, back to you.
Thank you, Gary. Let's just take a moment. We've been talking about rescue workers in some generic way, but obviously they have all kinds of skills. Give us a sense for all of us as to who these people are. Some are firemen, perhaps. There must be, we heard there are people from Con Ed, the gas company, structural specialists. Who are these people?
That's right. You have people from all walks of life. First of all, you have New York City policemen and New York City firemen who are participating in it. And that's one of the reasons that we have so many firemen and policemen. Also Port Authority policemen. The Port Authority is the agency that owned the World Trade Center. That's one reason why so many of them are missing, because they were on the scene right away. But you also have people from other walks of life. You have people with the New York City Housing Department who are helping to clear the area. You also have volunteers who just came the first day, were allowed in when they needed help right away. People who really have little knowledge about this, but who are being given jobs when they got to the scene to help out. So you have people from all walks of life participating in this, and at times there are more than 2,000 people on the scene behind me helping out. And keep in mind, it's hard for you to grasp, especially if you haven't seen the World Trade Center before, but when you have 220 stories of 2 buildings that topple, it's a huge area, and this area is 10 blocks wide by 10 blocks long roughly that you have debris. So it's a huge area, and that's why there have to be so many people there helping out.
And they're doing 12-hour shifts, we understand, Gary. They have to be fed. Is just food being brought in? This must be with 2,000 people there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in these coming weeks. This is a massive logistical support effort, quite aside from the work they have to do there in the rubble.
Well, Garrick, let me tell you about that. I spent some time with a paramedic yesterday. She was actually there for 31 hours straight, from the beginning of this for 31 hours. And she took me with her to the site. I spent some time with her at the site. I just can't tell you how incredible being there was, and just I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I had been here for a day and a half covering this from a few blocks away, and I was just totally stunned by the magnitude of this. But one thing I did notice, what you're referring to among the workers, yes, there's lots of food and lots of beverages, and you have people. One type of person who's been helping out are people who pass out the drinks and the food. And what they do is they walk around with trays and just hand it out to people as they go. Do you want some water? Do you want a soda? Do you want some food? So there's plenty of food and drinks for the people who are helping out.
Gary Tuchman, thank you very much. That kind of fuel and sustenance, if you will, for the rescue workers there in Lower Manhattan. Now back to Jim and Colleen.
All right, Garrick, thanks. And Garrick making a point about the massive logistical support necessary for the aid workers, but there's also some logistical support available for the friends and relatives, of course, of people who are missing. They're the people who are bearing the agony of not knowing the fate of the people missing in all of this. Day and night, they've lined the streets desperately searching for their loved ones, most of them actually carrying homemade flyers with pictures and telephone numbers. Many of them tell of precious last-minute phone calls from family members or friends.
I have a lot of hope He left home that morning and he hasn't called back since then. He's a cadet. He's a trained EMT, and most probably as soon as he came into Manhattan, he just flagged someone down to go down and help the people in the World Trade Center bombing thing, just to help people take them out. He's a trained EMT. If anybody has seen him, most probably he's helping people.
He called his wife early in the morning on Tuesday, told him the 88th floor was being evacuated. He was leaving. He left, and they never found him again. They never haven't seen him.
Well, public statements about the investigations into the attacks have so far focused on Muslim fundamentalists, and you can see the emotion in all of this. All of it's combined to create a bit of a backlash against some Muslim Americans in cities such as Chicago and Los Angeles. And it's prompted former President George Bush to warn against stereotyping. Listen in.
If, as the preliminary evidence suggests, this was an act of bin Laden or some related group, or perhaps an entirely different group of radicals, we should be mindful that these were not the acts of all Muslims who, like Christians and Jews, believe in a God of love and mercy. Rather, these were senseless murders committed by religious extremists who kill out of hate.
This is Bill Clinton on the streets of New York trying to comfort those waiting for word on their missing family and friends. Clinton urged people to donate money to aid funds for the victims. He told the people there that the U.S. will find out who is responsible for the attacks. Well, some airports across the United States have reopened for business, but passengers are facing some tougher security measures. Now, no knives allowed at all, including plastic ones. No curbside or off-airport check-in allowed. Only ticketed passengers are allowed past metal detectors. Also, security personnel have to meet higher standards as well. And more federal marshals will be on hand at large airports. Jim?
Now, while those airports slowly return to normal operations, Northwest Airlines grounded all of its U.S. flights Thursday evening. The major carrier says it received information that it would not be prudent to fly at this time. Northwest did not mention why several earlier flights had been canceled. The airline set to resume operations on Friday. While most international flights into the United States are still prohibited, some that had been diverted to Canada on Tuesday were allowed to return to the United States. The first to land was an Alitalia plane flying from Calgary from Los Angeles. Further north in the Golden State, San Francisco's airport also opened up shop. CNN's James Hattori caught one of the first flights out.
The fifth busiest airport in the U.S. didn't look so busy Thursday morning as the nation's airlines struggled to regain their wings. One reason, no more curbside check-in. Bags must go to the counter. So now the crowds are inside. That's where I was, trying to get on a flight to Salt Lake City, Utah.
It's about 2 hours before our plane takes off, and the line of passengers here is about as long as a football field. We're not even sure the plane's going to be taking off. I did see a crew starting to go through the gate. That's encouraging.
I'm not going to believe we're going until I'm on the flight and we take off the runway.
The FAA now requires airlines to scrutinize passengers more carefully. Some changes are apparent. One new question: do you have any sharp objects like knives or scissors?
They took my scissors away.
At the check-in?
I guess my scissors were too pointy at the top.
In addition to ID checks, some bags, apparently picked at random, are hand-searched, and only ticketed passengers allowed into the gate area. Less obvious changes: all aircraft must now be thoroughly checked for explosives before they're put into service for the day. The airlines are no longer permitted to carry cargo or mail within the continental U.S., except for the U.S. military. But with the tragedy in New York City still unfolding, no one seems to mind the delays and a little hassle.
You keep remembering so many people have it so much worse. I mean, this is nothing. You know, if you don't get out today, I don't get out today. At least I'm here and not there. So.
Some say Americans haven't paid enough attention to airline security.
We want things very convenient. We're a convenience-oriented people, and you can't have secure convenience.
Finally, after 3 hours to check in, we're off. Delta Flight 2027, a short 80-minute hop, which surprisingly is nearly empty, just 25 passengers. I wonder how many were left at the airport, still in line.
All in all, our short trip was uneventful. A little longer, a few more questions than normal.
but for a while at least, nothing about U.S. air travel will be normal. James Hattori, CNN, Salt Lake City, Utah.
And the American Automobile Association has released figures that should ease fears of widespread price hikes across the United States. There were reports Thursday of some outlets doubling their prices. That sparked fears of nationwide panic buying, with long lines forming in some states such as Indiana. But the AAA says that prices nationwide have risen by just 0.8 of a cent. That's an increase it describes as barely perceptible.
Now, the concerns of the fallout over this tragedy spread around the world, and that is the global economic situation. Of course, the markets in the United States closed until Monday, but they are open right now in Asia. Let's go now to London and Richard Quest for the latest there.
Indeed, Jim. Investors around the world, they're still trying to come to terms with the impact of what happened on Tuesday. It's now been 3 days since Wall Street last did business. And of course, without New York's guidance, it's been a very different sort of trading world, especially in Europe and Asia. A look at the numbers. Tokyo is up more than 3%. Hong Kong is down 0.5%. Singapore is down 3%. I think one has to point out that the markets did suffer very sharply in the days after the attack in New York, and perhaps that number in Tokyo is something of a rebound. A quick look on the currency markets. Trading is extremely subdued. The dollar is holding below the 119 level, coming in at 119.03. The euro at 90.95. The pound sterling is trading at 147. Although what we're hearing from traders is that it's about 50% of normal activity taking place, New York being such an important part of the foreign exchange market. No surprises from the European Central Bank on Thursday. It decided to hold interest rates exactly where they were. And in the United States, the Chicago bond market opened its pits on Thursday. It was a shortened trading session where Treasury prices went higher. But the market's big test, of course, is on Monday. That's when US stock exchanges will resume trading after the 4-day shutdown. As rescuers continue their grim task of sifting through the rubble in New York, it's now becoming clear the size and scale of the damage inflicted, not only from the destruction to the World Trade Center, but to the surrounding buildings and businesses. The insurance industry believes the cost of repairing the physical damage could be anything up to $15 billion. CNN's Charles Hodson now reports from Zurich and London on the world's insurance companies who'll pay the bill.
Union flags are flying at half-mast outside London's Lloyd's insurance market in sorrow at Tuesday's terrible human toll. Now the industry is also calculating what it needs to do to cover the financial cost. There's the physical destruction of buildings and airplanes, but beyond that there'll be life and injury insurance claims, liability claims against the airlines over lack of security, and above all business interruption, loss of sales as Lower Manhattan remains closed. The industry can only guess how much that'll all come to.
All we know is it's huge. It will probably be the largest insured loss that we've had. May not be, don't know.
Analysts say stock markets wiped $50 billion off the value of major insurance companies right after Tuesday's attacks. Those stocks have now come back up to levels which reflect the sum now seen as the most likely final cost, $20 billion. That is more than the 10 to 15 billion the industry is suggesting, but not enough to disturb the calm at Europe's other major insurance centre, Zurich. Zurich Financial Services may have to pay out hundreds of millions of dollars. Its neighbour, Swiss Re, is looking at a figure closer to $1 billion. Executives share universal shock and distress at the attacks, but say financially they can take them in stride.
This is the moment that we are in business for. We absorb the large risks that the world has, and this is one of those risks. And we stand ready to help our clients get through the financial aspects of these kinds of events.
What the industry is really saying is this is what we're here for. We want to help with the financial impact of these attacks, and we're working together to do so. Charles Hodson, CNN, London.
That's all the business news from London for the moment. European trading starts in the next couple of hours. Now back to Colleen in Atlanta. Colleen, it may seem somewhat unfortunate and very sad that we do talk about money at times like this, but of course this was an attack at the heart of world capitalism.
Yeah, a symbol and a reality, Richard.
Richard, I have a question for you before you go, and it's something I didn't expect to see. I'm getting emails, some of the financial newsletters I get, advising Americans, don't change your investments. Leave them right where they are. Don't move them right now. It'll send the wrong signal. Others saying, go out there and spend some money, show consumer confidence. What are we to make of this? Is there a reaction, a human reaction coming from the money managers?
Well, at the moment, everybody's saying pretty much don't do anything. In times of crisis, in times of panic, the worst thing that any investor can do is take a decision that they will regret shortly thereafter. There's no doubt there will be a reaction in the US markets when they open on Monday. But markets have a habit of coming back. They have a knee-jerk reaction. We saw that quite clearly, Jim, just on Tuesday. They saw what was happening in New York. They reacted. Now we're seeing the unwinding of those positions. Europe didn't fall very heavily yesterday. Tokyo's actually up today. This is entirely normal. Markets react on the instant of news. So I would strongly suggest that wait and see. On the question of the wider question of recession, on the wider question of what this will mean to economies, the jury is still out. People don't know. If this crisis in New York causes a consumer crisis of confidence in the United States, it will make matters worse. But there's little doubt that no investor should take a decision in a time of panic. Wait and see exactly what happens. There'll be plenty of time to make your decisions further down the road.
All right, Richard, we trust your advice. You know that. Thanks for being with us.
Richard, thanks so much. Well, in Britain, the Queen and other members of the royal family are going to attend a service of remembrance at St. Paul's Cathedral. That's going to happen in London on Friday.
And get this, it was at Buckingham Palace today that the Queen ordered her royal guards to play the Star-Spangled Banner. That is an unprecedented break with tradition. We get more on the story from Libby Weiner.
The changing of the guard, a pageant normally performed mainly for tourists, transformed into a show of support for Britain's most important political ally. The American ambassador to London, William Farish, had been invited to attend the ceremony with the Duke of York. And in an unprecedented move, it was his country's anthem that was played first. Hundreds of Americans were gathered outside to listen as the band of the Coldstream Guards played the familiar tune. They then stood in silence as a mark of respect to the many thousands killed. The ambassador who will meet the Queen was said to be deeply moved by her decision to hold this special ceremony. Many visitors were also touched. The ceremony today is a powerful symbol of Britain's support for America. The Queen's decision to interrupt her holiday and return for a special service in London tomorrow, a sign of the royal family's awareness of the need to be seen to be standing side by side with the United States. Libby Weiner, ITN, at Buckingham Palace.
Well, it is nearly 2 a.m. in New York, and we saw in Gary Tuchman's live shot just a few minutes ago a light rain falling. Some heavy rain fell earlier, but still the search for any possible survivors buried beneath the remains of the World Trade Center does go on at this hour.
The rescue workers are still there. Also, there's some of the people desperately looking for their loved ones. We're going to leave you now with some of the thoughts that they had this day.